You are listening to The Bail Post. Welcome to our next episode of our podcast, The Bail Post. And on today's episode, we have a guest. His name is Daniel Greenfield. He's been a writer, a columnist, and a journalist for nearly 20 years. In that time, he's tackled stories across the country and around the world. He has had the honor of working alongside legends in the field like David Horowitz, and he's met senators and congressmen, as well as telling the stories of ordinary people struggling against impossible odds. He is a Shillman journalism fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Well, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for agreeing to be on our podcast. We're going to talk today about an article that you've written that I noted, and then I've started watching the news, and it's something that we're not really talking about. And the first person I've heard talk about it is Donald Trump. But before we get to that, I thought I would just kind of give you the opportunity to talk about who is David Horowitz for our listeners who may not know.
Oh, David Horowitz started out as a radical activist, well on the left. He was a socialist, and at some point it turned around for him, particularly when a friend of his was murdered by Black Panthers. And at that point, he had to reevaluate a lot of his thoughts about crime, about politics of the right and the left, and he became a vigorous conservative activist, an activist for the rule of law, and that's what he's been. He's been an incredible influence on the conservative and the rule of law movement.
Well, and I noticed that, he started out, like you said, he started out writing stories as the far left or supporting the far left's principles. And then over time, he went through a conversion, or he changed his positions, and he became a conservative. And I think that, there's jokes that we hear all the time about when you're young, you're liberal, and when you're old, you're conservative. But I think, he's we have a lot of people that go through that experience where, when I first went to college, I took a test in the first class I had, and I just knew that this test was going to say I was a liberal since I was a political science major. But when I took the test, because that was during the time of Ronald Reagan, I turned out to be very conservative in very close to Ronald Reagan. And so these labels, when you're young, you don't know what they mean, but when you get older, they become meaningful to you as I guess you have your life experiences.
Yeah. When you actually ask people based on specific issues, especially when it comes to public safety, when it comes to individual independence, a lot of people actually test more conservative.
We're here today to talk about the article that you've written called California Legalized Drugs and Cartels Took It Over, which was published on June 21st, 2024 at the Gateson Institute International Policy Council. What brought you, or what made you interested in this area?
I've actually been writing about what I call pro-crime policies for quite a while now, including drug legalization and the completely destructive effects of that. And being unfortunate enough to live in California, I've been covering the local disaster for quite a while. It's something I see just walking down the street. You have these tents and tents and tents. The so-called homeless crisis, which now has been renamed to the more politically correct unhoused. And there's the promise that there would be a whole lot of revenue coming in from drug legalization. Denver was supposed to, have innovated with this. In reality, drug revenue legalization has dropped quite a bit over the past few years. A lot of these businesses that opened, they were going to have multi-billion-dollar valuations by getting into the cannabis business. A whole bunch of them have now gone under. We still have dispensaries around, but the reality is the majority of cannabis sales are to illegal outlets, to illegal growers. And California is still fighting a drug war. It's not just a revenue drug war. They're raiding grow sites. They're raiding dispensaries because they're not legally licensed. They're not paying the government their share. And in practice, the cartels are, as mentioned in the article, taking a big bite of this business.
Why is this a topic that we're not really seeing in the news, that the illegal drug trade is taking over the legal drug trade in the states where it's being legalized?
You can see in the news, it's just there, buried in the back pages. There's no larger overview. No conclusions are drawn because those conclusions are politically incorrect. The conclusion would be that this entire policy of legalizing drugs has failed very, very badly. And not only is it obviously feeding into cartels taking over marijuana traffic, along with mass shootings, by the way. We're not talking about just dispensaries here. We are talking about vigorous competition to control the growth of marijuana. There was a mass shooting of 6 people at one particular illegal grow site here. There have been mass shootings and killings in general elsewhere in the country. But also these same cartels are also moving harder drugs. They're also involved in the fentanyl traffic. So you can't even distinguish between the cartels that are bringing in, that are working on grow sites, and those that are bringing in harder drugs that are killing people on a constant basis. And also this ties into the border crisis because this now
Mhm.
allows these organizations to bring in as much cheap labor as they want, which means none of the legally licensed businesses can even begin to compete with them. The result is chaos. The result is violence. The result is
Mhm.
crime. You have hikers who sometimes go into places. There was a case a few months back, and they just disappear. And the suspicion is they stumbled on a legal growth
Sure.
site, and that's it. That's gone. And we're talking about, normal people are just going on a day hike.
Well, there's a new documentary out on Apple TV that's called Cowboy Cartel, and it was just released August 1st. And it's a story about from 2009 where the cartels were bringing in from Mexico, bringing in their money and washing the money through the quarter horse industry. And I just thought, as I was preparing for today, how interesting. 2009, they're taking the proceeds from their drug trade and washing it through the quarter horse industry. Now, in 2024, they're not even attempting to wash. They're coming in and taking over and moving their uh, marijuana trade and businesses all the way into the United States and across the country in different locations.
Across the country. Indeed, you have, by the way, Mexican cartels. You also have Chinese triads that's showing up in New England and Maine. If you've got an area that's not very well policed, that has a lot of open space, particularly around here, it's national forest. Elsewhere, also areas that are restricted to logging and developing. Cartels love that. They come in, they take it over, and they're capitalists. They have big ambitions, they have big plans, and they're good at executing them, and they don't have to worry about government regulations. You want to get into the legal marijuana business, you have to jump through a lot of hoops. Here in California, you've got this
Yeah.
entire, I think, 20-member council that has to sign off on who actually gets licenses, and you're paying a significant amount of money. In New York, there was this plan to have people who had been convicted of drug crimes to actually be the first to get drug licenses. You're dealing with the cartels. They don't have to do any of this stuff. They can just go in. They don't have to deal with regulations. They don't have to deal with OSHA. They have to pay zero licenses, and they also have nothing to worry about because a lot of these crimes have been decriminalized, which means, they're just getting them on technical violations. They're seizing the property. They're destroying the pot, but they can't seriously lock them up. They would have been able to 10, 15 years ago.
Seems like one of the things that we're seeing from the criminal justice reform or the bad bail reform that we're having, they no longer file enhancements on crimes. That's one of the things that if you have a DA that's been supported by Soros, that you agreed you won't do those enhancements. So instead of when you find somebody with a whole bunch of drugs on them, you just charge them with possession of drugs, not the weight. So instead of getting 20 years, they get 2 weeks. And so 2 weeks is the cost of doing business. And if they're in one of those areas, then they don't see that as a problem, I guess.
No, they have nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
Decriminalization, pro-crime policies, combined with progressive prosecutors and, these days progressive judges, particularly around here where they're judges that are elected and they're backed by the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. They're going to give all these people a pass with absolutely no compunction because to them, the idea is the criminal justice system has been fundamentally unfair. It's
Mhm.
been harmful. And so, they're now remedying the harm, but in practice, they're not remedying the harm so much on whatever imaginary local small-time drug dealers they're thinking of. They're actually ushering in and opening the door for international criminal organizations out of China, out of Latin America.
And that's the point I've been making for a long time. When you tie the hands of judges, uh, in the name of being fair or protecting the poor, you're also tying the hands of judges so that they can address organized crime, career criminals, or gang members. And I think what you're saying is that's exactly what's happened.
The pro-crime movement claims that they can create some sort of fundamental distinction between small time and big time. Governor Newsom has been
Mhm.
making this argument all along. They've been fighting the rearguard battle against actually recriminalizing criminal acts. And when it comes to shoplifting, for example, we're going after the large-scale organized rings. The reality is you
Mm.
don't always know who's an organized ring or not.
Yeah,
You create a permissive atmosphere where people just casually are going in and walking out of a store and taking things with them. You're also creating a perfect environment for organized rings to operate under. Even if
sure.
you throw the books at those people, and a lot of the time the progressive DAs don't want to throw the books at them, as particularly if they recruit younger, particularly under
Mhm.
18, those people are going to get a pass no matter what.
We've seen, the impact of that with stores closing because they can't withstand $25,000 a day of shoplifting, and you see where the impact that has on commercial property values, like in San Francisco. But let's go back. You mentioned in your article that the Colorado model for legalizing marijuana was kind of, the beginning point. How would you describe the Colorado model for legalizing marijuana?
But the focus was on all the money we would make from doing it.
Mhm.
We would legalize cannabis. Then, all the businesses would get their licenses. We would charge massive taxes on them, much as we did with tobacco, which is one factor. Sin taxes obviously have been a major part
Mhm.
of financing government, whether it was replacing prohibition with liquor taxes that were supposed to be a substitute for a personal income tax. Of course, we got a personal income tax and a liquor tax also. Cigarette taxes, and of course, they wanted to tax the cigarette business incredibly, but they also wanted to drive it out of business, which is a contradiction in terms. They've been getting some of what they wanted. Tobacco revenues are
Mhm.
down, so marijuana revenues were supposed to fill that void.
Yeah, but
The
isn't the
problem,
bigger difference between them is you have a large black market for
Mhm.
illegal drugs, but you really didn't have that for cigarettes. And so when they're doing this, hey, this is what's going to happen because we've done it before. They're really missing out on a key component of the decision making.
Well, the funny thing is, we actually did end up with an illegal market for cigarettes precisely
Mm.
because they taxed it to such a ridiculous degree. And we actually had international criminal organizations, including Hezbollah, which is an Islamic terrorist group, that actually got into the cigarette smuggling business. But it's still smaller money, and we had declining youth. Thus, they had to, they were thinking, this is going to be the new cigarettes. We're going to have cannabis. We're going to tax it at even higher rates. The
Yeah,
problem is that, yes, they were making a certain amount of revenue initially. A bunch of businesses jumped in. And you had bigger companies that formed like MedMen, some operating out of Canada, that were supposed to be had valuations initially in the billions. They were going to be publicly traded. But a lot of this did not work out. Some of it was federal regulations, but there was also the larger issue, which is, yes, they were making some money from taxes, but the social costs of legalizing marijuana and attracting all the sorts of people who were excited by the idea coming to Denver were higher. You walk around Denver sometimes, you see some of that. You see some of the crime, you see some of the homelessness, you see some of the social problems that were
sure.
created. And the
Well, you
problems,
mentioned that, like the legislature still brags that they're bringing in 282 million for tax revenue for the marijuana industry. But what were the projections? I mean, it sounds like the projections were much higher than 282 million if that's down.
yeah, they were expecting steady growth. So that,
Mhm.
you have companies that had these massive investors, and I mean, multi-billion dollar valuations like MedMen. They hired major DC
Mhm.
lobbyists. They were expecting
Mhm.
this kind of massive growth. You still have some of these companies that are into, online deliveries, but the revenues have actually trended the other way because, for the most part, the public sees no convincing reason to buy from so-called legal dispensaries unless you're buying, you're upscaling it, or you're just very, very lazy, or you have plenty of money to throw around. And actually, what happened post-pandemic is the revenues actually began declining. Maybe people are more comfortable going out and meeting drug dealers, whatever it is. But both in Colorado and California, other places, revenues are declining, which is really bad if you're an investor and you've put in money expecting these companies to go big.
Yeah, I was going to say, and then you got companies that were supposed to be really worth a lot of money, and they're declaring bankruptcy, so they're going out of business. And it
Yeah.
seems like as the model has spread from Colorado to other states like California, I guess Portland, other areas, uh, but the model has failed, and so we've got the criminal element, the cartels taking over the industry. I mean, how big? I mean, how big a problem is that? Do you think that they're close to taking over the market, or they've gotten 50% of the market? I mean, how bad of a problem is it?
Well, the illegal market is a bit chatty. What we know is the majority of people are buying marijuana through the illegal market,
Hmm.
not through the legal market. There's no dispute about that point. The idea that we're going to convert all these people into legal
Sure.
customers has absolutely failed. Secondly, the cartels, we don't know exactly how much of it they control, especially because their hands-on operations can vary, but they are taking in more and more of it, and we see massive raids. And, the
Yeah.
old school big time raids, those are obviously cartel properties. People who can operate at that scale are cartel. And increasingly in some areas, particularly in California and Maine, if you want to actually be in this business, you have to have protection. So, whether the cartel is directly running things or not, you're going to be paying them a percentage of it. And if not, bad things will happen. We've seen a string of killings, a string of disappearances that suggest the cartels are continuing to consolidate the industry. And there's really no barrier to them continuing to do so as long as drugs remain decriminalized, as long as the border remains open.
The big shock to me is this is all happening in the US. This isn't happening in Mexico and they're just bringing the drugs across the border and smuggling in and then taking the cash back. This is all the operations are taking place. And, where we're saying, we've got this legal market, but we've still got a black market that's taking it over or that's doing a large part of the business. I mean, government, which was going to have all this money, is spending a lot of it on trying to keep the illegal people from doing business. And so they're having to spend a large sums of money to track and go and, like you described, take over where where the cartels are having huge farms. And that's having a big toll on these taxes that they're bragging about, and also that we haven't even started talking about the crime effect. And I think the last thing, you mentioned the open borders. They're bringing in employees like crazy, using our own open borders policy against us.
It makes sense for them to set up operations here. We've got a lot of land. We also got a good infrastructure. We've got water and power, which they absolutely need. And we've got all these lands that are supposedly untouched for development because, these are places you can go hike and you're not going to do logging there. You're not going to be mean to the owls or any of the wonderful creatures that are there. And the cartels, of course, love this. The one thing they don't have is a lot of labor here. But the good news for them is they can actually just bring people across the border. And the incredible thing is they will advertise this not just south of the border. They will advertise even in European outlets, trying to solicit people, particularly from Eastern Europe, to come here. They can fly them into Cancun. They're just going to cross the border, claim refugee status. Then they're cheap labor. The incredible thing is we have these compounds, things you would have in the 80s, you would have associated with Latin America, guards, barbed wire, and drugs being just grown here because we just absolutely don't have the policing resources. The FBI is stretched thin, and local police forces even have limited authority to do anything about this.
You mentioned in your article they're bringing in people from Bulgaria, France, Russia. I mean, so it's not just a Mexico cartel. And you already mentioned the Chinese as well. So it's like a free for all right now for people coming to our country to take advantage, like you said, of us having we have large spaces where they can build and farm and cultivate illegal drugs.
You will see some of these buses, particularly on the East Coast, Chinese buses that move illegal workers around. They became trendy in recent years because they're inexpensive. People in general will try to ride them sometimes. But they move from Virginia to New York, Philly, all the way up to Maine, ultimately. And there's just a lot of land there. There's a lot of room for triads to begin to operate. Right, the triads were initially based in more Chinatowns and urban areas, but they've expanded their operations to rural areas, and you'll have these, very strange busts where you have a bunch of Chinese people that are being arrested in some, part of Maine where you absolutely do not expect them to be. And, they've got large compounds. They're growing this stuff there because it is a very profitable cash crop.
Let's carry that through. They're bringing in people illegally to the country to work there. They get arrested. I mean, it seems like either they're not going to be held accountable for that because we've decriminalized so much stuff, or they're just going to be deported. And so they can just do a complete circle and fly right back and be back on the job within a week or two.
Well, if they're operating in sanctuary states, officially or unofficially sanctuary states, then they don't have to worry about their people being deported unless they're busted by federal authorities like the FBI. If it's state cops busting them, then they're going to be arrested. They might, face charges or criminal trials, but they're not going to be deported. They're going to have good legal support, some of it pro bono, some of it from their own people, and they can just turn around and do this right over again. And considering what law enforcement looks like in the countries they come from, they're really not intimidated by this. Law enforcement, the countries they come from, is far more brutal and far more likely just to throw them in prison, and we're not going to do that here.
In some of our states, we've decriminalized some of these drugs, and we did it with the intention of taking the criminal element out and to raise a whole bunch of tax revenue so that we can do other things. And what's been the consequences on crime?
Obviously, social services itself has been strained by all this. But all these really things are entangled. So you have an open border, you have the legalization of drugs, you have the general decriminalization, and you have waves of crime radiating from that. Beyond the cartels, we've created a situation where people feel very comfortable getting into certain kinds of illegal businesses, which itself has a ripple effect of encouraging other people to get into it. And the people who are getting into it, well, they're looking for lower level employees. If they're successful at all at it, they're going to look for people who are going to do some other work for them. In many cases, this means minors. It's very popular to employ minors in the illegal drug business because they're going to face minimal charges. Thus, you've got kids being recruited in high school, even middle school, to do this work, whether it's runners, whether it's anything else. So there's certainly a general crime wave that's caused by decriminalization, by pro-crime policies, by general permissiveness, and drug legalization has absolutely preyed into that, as has the open border. You go to some cities and they're just in a state of chaos. New York, Chicago, there's really minimal law enforcement there. The police are outnumbered, outgunned. They generally don't want to get involved in anything anyway. And in that kind of situation, you have all sorts of crime beyond just drugs, beyond shoplifting, which we've already discussed. Mugging has become popular. Carjacking in some parts of the country are very popular, particularly Washington, D.C. You now have had multiple attacks on members of Congress and their staffers because that's just how permissive life has become in D.C.
Well, I was on a podcast just a couple of nights ago, and they're like, "Oh, Ken, you're wrong. Crime is, according to federal crime statistics, crime is down." And, when I'm saying, no, crime is not down, look in our urban areas, look at all the same things that you're pointing to. What is your response to these arguments from the left that crime, we're wrong. It's a perception issue. Crime is actually down.
Yeah, so they've made up the crime statistics argument before. It's highly dubious. There are a number of reasons. I don't want to go into too much statistical depth about that. One reason is simply the crime statistics are no longer being reported properly for a lot of areas. And we know this has been, the 90s was a boom era for weaponizing statistics. Now, in some cases, it was good. Comstat in New York under Giuliani was pretty effective because it actually gave a granular picture of where crimes were taking place. On the other hand, Chicago weaponized crime statistics in the other direction by simply refusing to report some crimes, or refusing to mark some crimes, in some cases by refusing to close cases entirely. There are a lot of statistical ways, the equivalent of Hollywood accounting for the criminal justice system, that you can use to distort the picture. Also, it's important to remember that when they say crime is down, they're looking at this in the sense of the 2020, which was a massive, massive year where crime shot up incredibly. Thousands of extra homicides occurred. So, you're stepping down from 2020, you are going to get some crime decreases, but that's because crime was massively goosed.
Yeah, but when you're down 10% or 20%, but it was up 40%, you're still got a 20% increase in crime.
Yeah, it's like the store, we're discounting this 30%. Well, we increased the prices 100%, 200%, and now it's down. But the bottom line is crime is very much ubiquitous. You can massage statistics a bit, and they do massage statistics. For example, they will focus on certain categories of crimes that are down, as opposed to ignoring more violent crimes that tend to be up. They also roll in, rural areas we have not seen the massive increases in crime that we have in other places. And if you start de-emphasizing urban crime rates, which they have, you can get the kind of results that they want to get. The bottom line is public perceptions of public safety are absolutely horrible, and there's a reason for that. People are not stupid.
Well, when the NAACP calls for, in Oakland, calls for a state of emergency on crime because it's so bad, I mean, that's the NAACP calling for a state of emergency on crime. I mean, you can't deny that crime's a problem when a left-wing group or a leftist group is calling for a state of emergency on crime.
Well, the funny thing is the NAACP back in the day was one of the organizations that helped trigger the so-called war on drugs, which is, blamed on Reagan, it's blamed on the right. Reality is the NAACP was reacting in panic to what they were seeing in Black communities. They pushed Richard Nixon, they pushed other elected officials to actually crack down on crime. There was a time when the NAACP was calling for the death penalty for drug dealers.
We've already mentioned a couple of times the impact on our border policies is something that these people or these groups are really taking advantage of. I mean, how can our national elected officials be setting an open borders policy and not acknowledge that these groups are taking advantage of their policy?
Well, first of all, they're denying that there is an open borders policy, though obviously everybody can see that there is indeed an open borders policy.
Yeah, they deny there's a problem. Our border's secure is what we hear from the left.
You just walk around New York and Chicago. I was just, there's you're around Union Square in New York City, and there's all these guys with Venezuelan flags. Why are there a bunch of guys with Venezuelan flags hanging around Manhattan? You see these people, you see them sleeping on the street, by the way. That's an increase in the homeless population. You see them committing all sorts of crimes. And cities are desperately moving them around. We mentioned Denver, Colorado recently. They've been desperate to move these migrants all across the country, particularly Governor DeSantis in Florida, others have been blamed for moving migrants around, but Democrat cities and states have been doing it too. They've been desperate to get these people. It's out. Everybody has kind of become a coyote. Everyone's been playing, pass the hot potato around with these migrants. So everybody's doing it. Everybody's doing it because there is a major crisis. You could fly into O'Hare Airport, and you can see parts of O'Hare Airport in Chicago that are just dedicated to migrants. You can see some of them being housed in police stations. It's going to be a major issue when the Democratic convention comes to town.
Explain how this decriminalization and this drug legalization, how does it increase homelessness? Because that was part of your article, is that it spiked or increased homelessness dramatically.
Well, if you make it easier for people to get, for people who actually already have addiction issues to get the stuff that they want, well, they're going to use more of it. They're going to fall through the cracks of the system, and they're going to find themselves outside. The majority of the homeless self-surveyed in LA had drug and alcohol problems. And in some parts of California, they've taken to treating this as a medical problem by providing them with drugs and alcohol. They actually have a program where they provide people who are seen as alcoholics with medicinal doses of alcohol. New York has set up smoking rooms, by which they don't, mean people with, cigars and pipes hanging around, but people who can come in and they can do crack cocaine or whatever it is they want to do, and they suppose it's safe environment. So not only have we made it all this easy for this to happen, but they're actively enabling it. They're actively supporting it. In some cases, they're actively funding it. They've provided crack smoking kits. They provided vending machines with crack smoking kits because safe use, and this is part of the pro-crime program, safe use has come to eclipse any kind of war on drugs. So the idea is we're going to make it safe for these people to not only use marijuana, but to use cocaine, to use heroin, to use fentanyl, which is absolutely insane. But they're claiming the emphasis is on stopping overdoses. So if they create a safe environment or they provide it for them, they can monitor how they use it. But the reality is, what are these people doing the rest of the time? Let's say they're not having overdoses. Let's say you're slowing down at least the rate at which they have overdoses. What happens next? What are these people doing during their day? Well, you see them on the street.
They're not getting these drugs for free. So they've got to do something to raise money or to steal something to get the proceeds so that they can then get their next hit. But I saw some statistics from Portland saying that they've gone from a 6% drug addiction to a 12% problem now. And they decriminalized pretty much all heavy drugs, and they're providing resources, or they're providing counseling or rehab, but they're having less than 0.01% of the people take advantage of it. And so they just set record numbers of people who are overdosing every month. And it seems like, what they promised and what we're getting is completely opposite. And we're in essence, we're giving up on a generation.
And you create a situation where a lot more people have easy access and nothing to worry about when it comes to drugs, and you don't actually have a better plan for turning those people around, then this is exactly what happened. And the situation in Portland and Seattle are absolutely catastrophic, which is why voters actually went ahead and said, the situation where hard drugs are decriminalized is absolutely unworkable, even in some of the more liberal parts of the country that actually tried to pioneer this. And we didn't actually need to conduct this horrible experiment over the last 10, 15 years because the European countries actually did this. We had Needle Park over in the Netherlands where they experimented with this. In Amsterdam, they had safe injection sites, and those places turned into horrible hellholes. We experimented with this to some degree in the 70s, but absolutely no lessons were learned. Then they turn around 30 years later and say, let's try this. We've never done this before. Well, we did this before.
In some ways, I say we're repeating the errors that we made in the 60s. We're just doing the same cycle. In the 60s, we felt more safe, so we were more forgiving on our criminal laws. and then we started having more crime, and we had a disagreement about how to fight it, and then side dug in their heels and said, "We're not going to help you," and so we had a backlash, and that's what brought us the war on crime. In some respects, I kind of see us repeating this. You can see in California, Prop 47 passed, and as a result of that, in our urban areas, we have decriminalized theft under $950, and that's why we have the shoplifting problem we have. But there's a proposition on the ballot for November to repeal Prop 47. Um, is do you think the public's at the point where that will pass?
I would hope so. The Democrat establishment here is put on a pitched battle to stop it. They try to field their own fake proposition that would have prevented this from happening. They eventually surrender to that because the pressure is high. A lot of people are upset, they're outraged, and they're getting tired of the lies. Governor Newsom had this famously ugly scene where he goes, I think, into a CVS or something, and there's somebody shoplifting, and he asks according to him, he asks the person behind the counter, why is this being allowed? And she tells him, well, the governor led, and he starts screaming at her. No, it's not the case. And the fact is that is exactly the case, because yes, as you said, $950, you're taking in less than $950, you get a free pass on it. And they can only deny this for so much.
In the last week or two, Governor Newsom also called for the removal of the homeless from the streets and asked cities to do it too across the state. And I'm like, I mean, is this really as a result of a ruling from the Supreme Court, or is it really as a result of we have an election in 4 months?
Oh, it's a mixed bag. The completely insane Idaho so-called camping decision, which created this crisis partially, which was the idea that people have a right to just camp out.
Yeah,
They can, on the sidewalk. They can just set up shop in front of your house, and all the bad legal decisions that resulted from that across the entire West Coast. Certainly, part of that stemmed from the legal support they got from the Idaho decision. Eventually, it came to the Supreme Court, and eventually, the Supreme Court did the same thing. But the idea that a lot of these politicians, including Governor Newsom, did not have a lot of complicity, that they didn't prop this up.
yeah.
And even now, they're not absolutely not serious about this. LA responded to Governor Newsom by saying, we're not going to do this. And the reality is most places are not going to do it because they're run by Democrats are well to the left. They're going to clear selectively some places. They're going to use that as a tool. So, they've already have various restrictions about homeless encampments in front of schools, for example, next to churches and things like that. Various council members in LA can come in and say, well, we don't want this in this part of our district. But the reality is, they can just set up shop elsewhere in the district. And if it were not an election, if we're not coming up to an election right now, and Governor Newsom was likely not trying to protect Kamala from some of the consequences of this, because as Attorney General, she has been responsible for some of this, including writing very misleading definitions for these propositions. The Attorney General in
Sure.
California is responsible for that, and thus, we had the Safe Streets Act, which is
Yeah,
the
that
exact
was Prop 47. Will make us safer. And I'm like, look, everything that they're titling stuff in California, ignore it because they had their prison population capped. Everything they've done is just to reduce their prison population, and anything they say about it is going to make us safer is not true, because they were just trying to reduce their prison population because they weren't not willing to build additional capacity.
Yeah, and that is an important point. So a good deal of the crime wave has been fed by the what they call the decarceration movement, some of the abolition, which is really a call not just to reduce the criminal population, but to get rid of prisons entirely, by the way.
How do we fix this? So I mean, this is a huge problem. The criminal justice reform, bad bail reforms, bad immigration policies, decriminalizing drugs, bringing cartels from various different countries to bring their operations to the United States. It just seems like it's a monumental problem. How do we get back on track in our country?
Well, first of all, we have to clarify what the problem is. In the 70s and the 80s, there was eventually a backlash about this because
Mhm.
we were clear about what was going on and who was doing it. The messaging on this for people who understand what's going on has been very poor. That's why I emphasize, I call it pro-crime. It's not criminal justice reform. It is pro-crime. These are policies that enable
Yes.
crime. And we have to have this larger perspective that there is a radical movement, one that does not just call for defunding police, one that calls for eliminating prisons, that calls for what they call reimagining public safety. And by the way, Kamala Harris was one of those people who made those arguments back when she was running for president. Their idea is that the criminal justice system is fundamentally inherently unfair, and that we actually need alternatives to police to prisons and all that. And these people have gotten their way. They've implemented these policies. They've
Yeah,
eliminated.
but so far they've failed everywhere. When you say, "Oh, people, you don't need bail because people want to come and resolve their cases." I mean, we've learned during the last few years, especially during COVID, that's absolutely not true. If you don't make them to come to court, they're not coming to court. When you have a
Mhm.
80% failure to appear rate in misdemeanor court across California, and you have that in uh, Harris County, which is Houston, Texas, because they're using the same type of simple release. I mean, that's failure, but nobody wants to acknowledge it.
Yeah, well, they in New York, they were providing them with bribes and incentives. They were giving them tickets to Mets games to get them to come to court. I don't know if that was really a reward or a punishment, but we know this doesn't work in terms of making the public safer. But their goal, this is a radical movement. Its goal is not to make the public safer. Its goal is to reimagine what the relationship between crime and public safety even is in the first place. They will contend that all crime is the result of social conditions. We have to reimagine society and capitalism rather than trying to punish people. And this is something that they were certainly saying very openly back in 2020. And we have to address that. We have to address the fact that this is the ideology at the heart of all the chaos, the misery, the crime that we're seeing.
We had an example in Houston, which is one of the largest cities in the United States, probably the third largest county in the United States, Harris County. And there was the Pasadena police chief, who I know, and he had somebody out on a simple release, commit another violent crime, and get arrested again. And he went to court to sit in the courtroom so the judge would know he was there, and he was asking, "You are you going to release him on another simple release mechanism?" And the judge told him, "Look, my party wants me to do this." So it's not about what's in the best interests of society. It's not about public safety. It's just about what my political party wants. And when we get politics to that level where we have one party's like focusing on decriminalization and also, creating, less public safety, more crime is you're going to have less public safety, but they don't want to acknowledge it. So they know they can't. So they're just saying, "Oh no, there's a perception problem. Crime's not going up," because they have to say that. Because if we were voting for Prop 47 to say we're going to vote for increased crime, it would have gone down. And so they have to say, "Oh, this will make us safer." But I'm still kind of, are we just going to have a backlash to get this corrected?
We urgently need a backlash, and we urgently need to understand just what is going on here. It's not policy failures. This is, from their perspective, a
Mhm.
policy success.
Okay.
They're creating the new world that they want to have. It's a world that most people hate, but this is exactly how they envision things happening. When somebody just kind of walks out of a store and shoplifts, to them, that's not a failure. To them, that's a success because they're transforming how capitalism works. And these fanatics, and this is an absolutely fanatical, radical ideology, are in the driver's seat on this. And everything they tell to the public is pretty much a lie. And the public, unfortunately, has fewer means of actually finding out what is really going on, which is why it's so important to actually correctly and clearly state this is not a failure of policy. It's not people who are incompetent, inept, who are just, naive. They're not naive. This is their vision for how America should work.
We know what works. We know what criminal justice theories work, and we know, broken windows theory. We know that other things that have been proven, and we teach in our colleges that this is what you do to lower crime in our criminology classes. But all the things that work are being systematically attacked as racist. And it's, to me, just a complete strategy. When they say our criminal justice system has systemic racism, to me, that's just an argument to try to change it to have more decriminalization. It's not anything about public safety. It's about, their political agenda for decriminalization. And I know when you have a coalition voting for something, there's some in the coalition that are hard left, there's some that are well intentioned, and it doesn't take much for them to lose their coalition when you start shining a light on it. We need more light being shined on these issues.
We need to very clearly connect people's experiences with crime with these policies. In some cases, policies that they've been tricked into voting for, like the Safe Streets Act. And even at the Criminal Justice Institute level, there are major problems. The John Jay Institute of Criminal Justice, for example, in New York, has largely been captured by Brennan Institute people. And the Brennan Institute is a think tank that is obsessed with decriminalization. There are a number of these think tanks. Soros is
Mhm.
bad. But it's not just Soros. There is an entire movement that has been championing this, that has gone into the judges' chambers. They've gone into the progressive prosecutors, they've actually built an entire system based on advancing their program. And there hasn't been anything similar, that kind of infrastructure, that kind of organization from the other side. There are occasional attempts to remove radical DAs, but that's not nearly enough. You have to actually counter this infrastructure with
Mhm.
infrastructure of our own.
When we first heard Soros was supporting DAs, I mean, it just sounded like a big, crazy conspiracy theory. But, when we now have Democrat DAs coming out and saying, when you are voted or elected into office with the support of Soros, you will be asked to attend a conference. And that conference, while not directly from Soros, it is indirectly funded by Soros. And when you get there, there's going to be a quid pro quo that says, since you received money from it, this is what we want. And we want you no longer will do this. You will no longer do this. You will no longer do enhancements. You'll no longer seek long sentences. And you see that, I mean, even if your state law requires you to do something opposite, they're still requiring it. I mean, we have examples from Florida where a DA was removed from office for not following state law. I mean this is crazy. I mean, it's no longer something that you think this is a crazy, thing that it can't be true. There's more than enough proof now to say this is absolutely what's happening, and it's having a terrible impact on our criminal justice system.
We've seen Alvin Bragg in Manhattan come out with his day one memo in which, he wouldn't even prosecute armed robbery anymore. That's absolutely, there are these guidelines, and the Governor DeSantis did the right thing by actually coming out and saying, no, you can't just violate state law. You can't make a commitment to violating state law, which is what they're doing. You can't come out and announce and say, these are laws I'm not going to enforce, because that is not the job of a prosecutor. And selective prosecution is actually part of the problem that we're seeing here, with these DAs coming forward and saying, well, we're going to enhance public safety by only prosecuting certain kinds of crimes. In reality, A, they don't actually believe in prosecuting any kinds of crimes. They simply know that there are red lines that the public won't go for. Alvin Bragg found that out with his day one memo. And the other thing is, it's not the job of prosecutors to legislate. And when they're engaging in selective prosecution, they are legislating.
I mean, you've got a great example that just happened. You have all the people that were involved in protests and at colleges across the country, and there were large numbers of people that eventually got arrested. But now into the summer, those urban DAs are just dismissing the prosecutions, a group at a time, and it's telling those groups that they have a green light when school starts in a couple of weeks to go back and hit it harder than they did the first time, because nothing happened to them. There were no consequences. And when there's no consequences on criminal justice reform, when there's no consequences on bad bail reform, that gives a green light to people to commit more crime, to do more activism, to create more chaos.
That is indeed the goal. It's so much the goal that here the LA Board of Supervisors responded to the violence at UCLA by voting to fund legal aid for those responsible. So it's not just an accident. When they actually ignore charges, when they actually fail to file charges, when they let them off, that is a tell. It's a very blatant tell. For example, you had one of the people involved in the pro-Hamas protest actually punched a female Capitol police officer during one of their occupations, and he got a pass. And it's very sharp contrast to what happened with those accused in January 6th. So there is that. There is the kind of double standard, but we also actually have overt examples of local political officials actually going out and rewarding and defending these people, including, by the way, the massive settlements that these groups received for their actions during the BLM riots, where they would claim that
Mm.
the police did something to make them uncomfortable, or the police were kettling them, and they got a multi-million-dollar payout, not because they actually won cases, but because the local authorities announced these settlements with them.
I've had to actually counsel people who were on the opposite side, on the conservative side, wanting to file similar suits when something happened. And I'm like, you don't understand. This is everybody on that side wanted to give money
Mhm.
so they could have a press conference saying how bad the local police were and how bad they acted. They're not going to be willing to do that for you, and the law isn't really in your favor. So that was more of a political thing, and also they're giving money to groups that are going to turn around and give it back to them. And I don't know how we stop that. But, the things that you've talked to me today about are really kind of eye-opening, startling, and things that you just don't think would happen here where we live. But if people wanted to find out more information about the articles you write or about your book, Domestic Enemies, how would they get that information?
Well, I have the honor of working for David Horowitz at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Our site is frontpagemag.com. My own personal site is danielgreenfield.org, and my book, Domestic Enemies, The Founding Fathers Fight Against the Left. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, hopefully wherever you shop.
Well, thank you so much for visiting with me today. I mean, I really can't say I enjoyed it. It was scary, but it was very informative. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great conversation. I think it's important we keep on talking about these things.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening, and come back for the next episode of The Bell Post.